1980. Kiss was drowning. The Unmasked album had crashed. Arena tours were shrinking to theaters, and the once unstoppable rock juggernaut was hemorrhaging money. But in a Connecticut basement studio, Ace Frehley was creating something that could have changed everything. 12 songs, raw, powerful, unmistakably brilliant. The album that nobody heard. The recordings that vanished for nearly 40 years. Until a summer day in 2019, when a dusty cardboard box in a New York garage revealed what might be rock history's greatest what-if moment. What was on those tapes? Why were they hidden? And could they really have saved Kiss from its darkest chapter? Before we dive into this mystery, if you're fascinated by untold rock history and behind-the-scenes stories that changed music forever, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. To understand the weight of what Ace created in 1980, you need to grasp just how desperate the situation had become. Kiss had dominated the 70s. They'd sold millions of records, filled stadiums, built an empire on theatrical rock and merchandising genius. But by the dawn of the 80s, the magic was evaporating fast. The Dynasty album in 1979 had marked a turning point, not the good kind. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were pushing the band toward disco-influenced sounds, toward mainstream acceptance. It worked commercially with "I Was Made for Lovin' You," but it alienated the core fan base. The fans who'd worshipped the dangerous, raw power of Kiss Alive and Destroyer felt betrayed. They didn't want synthesizers and dance beats. They wanted guitars that screamed, drums that thundered, and the primal energy that had made Kiss legendary. Then came Unmasked in May 1980, the album that almost nobody talks about now, because it represented everything wrong with Kiss at that moment. It was soft, it was commercial, it was desperate. Songs like Shandy and Tomorrow felt like transparent attempts to chase radio play, to grab at the pop audience. The harder edge that defined Kiss, that made them dangerous, had been sanded down to nothing. Sales reflected the disappointment. While Dynasty had gone platinum, Unmasked struggled to find an audience. The American tour was scaled down from arenas to smaller venues. In some cities, tickets weren't even selling out. For a band that had once been untouchable, this was humiliation. Ace Frehley watched all of this happening. He'd been increasingly marginalized during the Dynasty and Unmasked sessions. His guitar parts were being simplified, sometimes replaced by session musicians. His songwriting contributions were being rejected. Gene and Paul were taking firmer control of the band's direction, and that direction didn't include Ace's bluesy, raw guitar style. It didn't include the swagger and danger he brought. The space between Ace and his bandmates was widening into a chasm. He was drinking more. Showing up late to sessions, sometimes not showing up at all. The relationship was toxic, spiraling toward an inevitable end. But something was happening in private. Something nobody in the Kiss camp knew about. Ace was writing. Not just writing, he was recording. In a small studio space he'd set up in Connecticut, away from the politics and the arguments and Gene's controlling presence, Ace Frehley was creating music that sounded nothing like the watered-down Kiss of 1980. It sounded like classic Kiss. It sounded like Destroyer. It sounded like the band everyone was missing. Ace didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Not Gene. Not Paul. Not the management. He'd learned from his 1978 solo album experience that working independently gave him creative freedom Kiss no longer offered. That solo album had been a revelation, outselling the other 3 Kiss solo albums combined, proving that Ace Frehley had something special, something audiences wanted. New York Groove had been a genuine hit, climbing charts and getting radio play across America. It had validated him as more than just the guitar player in Kiss. He was a legitimate artist with his own voice. Now, 2 years later, he was channeling that energy again. The studio setup was modest, nothing like the high-end facilities Kiss used. But Ace didn't need fancy equipment. He had his Gibson Les Pauls, his Marshall amps, and the raw talent that had made him one of rock's most distinctive guitarists. He'd brought in a few trusted musicians, guys from the New York scene who understood his vision. Anton Fig, the drummer who'd played on his solo album, was there for several sessions. Some bass tracks were laid down by a studio player Ace had worked with before. Everything was done quietly, carefully, no publicity, no announcements, just pure creation. The songs emerging from these sessions were remarkable. They had the heavy riffing and melodic sensibility that defined Kiss's best work, but they also had something extra, a maturity, a depth. Ace was writing about real experiences now, about the pressures of fame, about feeling like an outsider in the band he'd helped build, about the struggle between artistic integrity and commercial demands. These weren't just party anthems. They were honest, raw expressions from a musician who'd been silenced for too long. One track in particular stood out, a 6-minute epic that started with a slow, bluesy intro and exploded into a blistering guitar showcase. The working title was Fallen Angel, and it was about watching something beautiful destroy itself. Anyone listening would know it was about Kiss, about the slow death of what the band had once represented. The guitar solo was stunning, 3 minutes of Ace pouring every ounce of frustration and passion into his Les Paul. It was the kind of playing that reminded you why Ace Frehley mattered, why his style had influenced a generation of rock guitarists. Another song, tentatively called Spacewalk, captured the cosmic vibe that had always been part of Ace's persona, but grounded it in heavier, more aggressive music. The main riff was instantly memorable, the kind of hook that gets inside your head and stays there. The lyrics played with the Space Ace mythology but twisted it, suggesting that the journey to the stars was really an escape from earthbound problems, from band politics and personal demons. There were faster songs too, straight-ahead rockers that would have killed in a live setting. Songs with the energy and attitude that Kiss had been missing since their mid-70s peak. If these tracks had been released, if they'd been put out as either a Kiss album or another Ace solo project, they could have reminded the world what real rock and roll sounded like. They could have shifted the narrative, shown that Kiss still had teeth, still had power. But here's the mystery that would haunt these recordings for decades. Ace never finished the album. By late 1980, the sessions simply stopped. The tapes were boxed up. The project was abandoned. And for nearly 40 years, almost nobody knew these recordings existed. The question that's tormented Kiss historians ever since those tapes surfaced is simple. Why? Why would Ace Frehley walk away from material this strong? Why hide it? Several theories have emerged over the years, each more intriguing than the last. The most practical explanation involves contractual obligations. Kiss members were bound by recording agreements that gave the band first refusal on any material they created. If Ace had revealed these songs, Gene and Paul could have claimed them for Kiss, potentially reworking them beyond recognition, or simply shelving them. By keeping the sessions secret, Ace maintained control. But control over unreleased music is still just silence. Maybe Ace realized he couldn't release the album without triggering legal warfare, so he chose to protect the work by keeping it hidden. A darker theory suggests that someone did find out about the recordings. Perhaps Eddie Kramer, the producer who'd worked with Ace on his solo album, heard rough mixes and warned him. If you release this now, Kiss will destroy you legally and professionally. Wait. Be patient. In 1980, Ace was still officially a Kiss member, still bound by the group's internal politics. Releasing a solo album that explicitly outclassed Kiss's current output could have been seen as betrayal, as an act of war. Maybe Ace was advised to wait until he'd fully separated from the band. But by the time that separation came in 1982, Ace was deep into personal struggles, and the momentum behind these recordings had evaporated. Ace has always been his own harshest critic. Maybe he listened back to the recordings and wasn't satisfied. Maybe he heard flaws that nobody else would notice. The vocals might not have been quite right, or the mix needed work he didn't have the resources to complete. Artists often abandon projects not because they're bad, but because they fall short of an internal vision. Ace might have decided these songs deserved better than he could give them at that moment, so he preserved them, thinking he'd return when circumstances improved. Except circumstances never did improve. Life got more complicated, not less. The grimmest possibility is that Ace's personal struggles simply overwhelmed everything else. By late 1980, his drinking had intensified. His relationship with Kiss was poisonous. His marriage was under strain. The creative fire that had driven the recording sessions may have been drowned in alcohol and despair. The tapes were boxed up not as a strategic decision, but as a symptom of someone losing control of their life. Music became secondary to survival. We may never know the true reason. Ace himself has been vague when asked about this period, his memories clouded by decades and by the substance abuse that defined those years. But the tapes existed. They were real, and they stayed hidden in boxes and storage spaces, moving from location to location as Ace's life moved through its various chapters. John Reagan knew what he was looking for, but he wasn't sure he'd actually find it. Reagan had played bass with Ace Frehley during the Frehley's Comet years in the late 80s, and over decades of friendship, Ace had occasionally mentioned the lost songs from 1980. Stories told late at night, hazy recollections of recording sessions that produced something special. But the tapes? Nobody knew where they were. Ace himself couldn't remember. Maybe they'd been thrown away. Maybe they'd deteriorated. Analog tape doesn't last forever, especially if stored improperly. Reagan was helping Ace sort through storage spaces, decades of accumulated gear and memorabilia scattered across different locations. One storage unit in Queens contained old amplifiers, guitar cases, boxes of papers and photographs. Nothing organized, just the chaos of a rock and roll life. In the back corner, underneath a road case and a torn equipment cover, Reagan spotted a cardboard box with CT Studio 1980 written in faded marker on the side. His heart started racing. He pulled the box out, opened it carefully. Inside were reel-to-reel tapes, 12 of them, each labeled with song titles in Ace's handwriting: Fallen Angel, Spacewalk, Broken Heroes, Midnight Rebel. Names that meant nothing to anyone but Ace. The tapes looked intact, no obvious signs of degradation. But the real question was whether they'd survived 40 years in less than ideal conditions. Reagan called Ace immediately. "I think I found them. The 1980 sessions. They're here." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Ace's voice, quiet and stunned. "Are you serious?" Within days, the tapes were taken to a professional audio restoration facility in New York. These specialists work with archival recordings, salvaging music from deteriorating formats. They loaded the first reel onto a vintage tape machine, calibrated everything carefully, and pressed play. What emerged from the speakers was astonishing. The recordings had survived. Nearly 4 decades in a cardboard box, and the sound was still there, still powerful. The fidelity was remarkable for basement studio sessions. You could hear every note of Ace's guitar, every nuance of his playing. The performances were raw and energetic, capturing something that studio perfection often kills. Ace listened to these recordings for the first time in almost 40 years. According to people who were there, he was emotional. This was his younger self speaking across time, a version of Ace Frehley who was still fighting, still believing he could make music that mattered. The songs were better than he'd remembered. They deserved to be heard. While the full album has never been officially released, enough information has leaked through various sources to give us a picture of what those 12 songs represented. Fallen Angel remains the centerpiece, the song everyone talks about. It's the epic track, the one that showcases Ace's growth as a songwriter and guitarist. The structure is ambitious, moving through different sections, building tension and releasing it. The lyrics tell a story of corruption and loss, but they're delivered with enough ambiguity that they could apply to a person, a band, an entire scene. The guitar solo has been described by those who've heard it as one of Ace's finest moments on record, a blues rock tour de force that ranks with his best work on Kiss albums. Spacewalk is the crowd pleaser, the track that could have been a radio single. It has that immediate hook, the kind of riff that makes you want to turn the volume up and drive too fast. The song maintains the cosmic theme that was always part of Ace's identity but gives it a heavier edge. This isn't novelty space rock. It's serious, muscular, arena-ready. In a parallel universe, this song became a hit, and Kiss's 1981 tour was built around its energy. Broken Heroes is more introspective, a mid-tempo song that explores the gap between image and reality. It's about the masks people wear, literally and figuratively. Anyone familiar with Kiss history recognizes the metaphor. The makeup, the personas, the gap between who the band members were on stage and who they were in private. Ace singing about Broken Heroes in 1980 was eerily prophetic. Within 2 years, he'd leave Kiss, and within 3 years, the entire band would remove their makeup, acknowledging that the personas couldn't be sustained. Other tracks vary in style and intensity. Some are straight-ahead rockers in the vein of classic Kiss. Some experiment with different sounds, showing Ace stretching beyond the formula. There's apparently a ballad, something gentle and acoustic-driven, that reveals a more vulnerable side. People who've heard it compare it to Beth, the Peter Criss sung ballad that became a surprise hit for Kiss in 1976. If Ace's ballad had been released, it might have challenged perceptions of him as just a guitar hero. What runs through all 12 songs is authenticity. These aren't calculated attempts to chase trends or please record executives. They're an artist creating music that feels true to him without compromise. That authenticity is precisely what Kiss was missing in 1980. And that's why these recordings are so tantalizing. They represent a path not taken, a version of events where artistic integrity won over commercial calculation. The big question, the one that makes this story more than just a curiosity: could these recordings actually have altered Kiss's trajectory? It's impossible to know for certain, but let's consider the scenario. Imagine if Ace had found a way to release this material in late 1980 or early 1981, either as a Kiss album or as his second solo project. The music industry was shifting. The raw, heavy sound was coming back into fashion. Bands like AC/DC were proving that straightforward. No-frills rock still had massive appeal. Van Halen was dominating with virtuosic guitar work and energetic performances. The new wave of British heavy metal was emerging, bringing aggression and authenticity back to the forefront. Kiss was positioned perfectly to capitalize on this shift, except they were moving in the opposite direction. They were softening their sound, chasing pop radio. But if Ace's album had come out, sounding raw and heavy and real, it could have reminded people what Kiss was supposed to be. It could have created pressure within the band to return to their roots. Gene and Paul might have recognized that the audience wanted power, not polish. More importantly, it could have given Ace leverage. His 1978 solo album had outsold the others, proving his commercial viability. If the 1980 recordings had been equally or more successful, Ace wouldn't have been the marginalized member anymore. He'd have been the guy whose vision was actually working, whose instincts about music were proving correct. That could have shifted the internal power dynamics. Instead of being pushed out, Ace might have been pulled back in, given more creative control. The Elder, Kiss's disastrous concept album from 1981, might never have happened. That album, with its pretentious progressive rock aspirations and complete disconnection from what Kiss fans wanted, nearly killed the band's career. It sold poorly, toured poorly, and represented Kiss at their most lost and confused. If Ace's raw, powerful music had been the template instead, the band's path through the early 80s could have been completely different. But we're dealing in hypotheticals. The recordings stayed hidden. Kiss continued down their troubled path. Ace's marginalization continued until his departure in 1982. And the what-if question remains one of rock history's most intriguing. After the discovery in 2019, there was immediate speculation about whether the recordings would be officially released. Ace was initially enthusiastic, talking publicly about cleaning up the tapes and sharing them with fans. There was discussion of re-recording some tracks with modern production, or releasing the original versions as historical artifacts with enhanced sound quality. But as of now, years later, no official release has materialized. The reasons are complicated. There are likely legal issues involving ownership of the recordings. Kiss, as a corporate entity, still holds significant control over anything connected to the band's history. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley might have contractual claims on material recorded during Ace's time as a Kiss member, even if it was done independently. Negotiating those rights is complex and potentially expensive. There's also the question of quality versus nostalgia. The tapes sound good for basement recordings from 1980, but do they meet modern standards? Would releasing them as is diminish their mystique? Ace is a perfectionist when it comes to his music. He might not want these raw sessions representing his legacy unless they can be properly finished, mixed, and mastered. But that kind of work takes time, money, and energy that may not be available. Some tracks have apparently been reworked and incorporated into more recent Ace Frehley albums. Bits and pieces of melodies, riffs, lyrical ideas that originated in 1980 but found their final form decades later. In that sense, the Lost album isn't entirely lost. It's been cannibalized, its DNA scattered across Ace's subsequent work. But the original vision, the 12 songs as they existed in 1980, remains unreleased. For Kiss fans and rock historians, that's frustrating. We have this tantalizing glimpse of what could have been, but we can't fully access it. It's like finding a lost Shakespeare play, but only being allowed to read stage directions. The full experience remains just out of reach. Beyond the specific story of these recordings, there's a larger narrative about the music industry and the choices artists face. Kiss in the 70s and 80s represented one of rock's fundamental tensions: the balance between artistic vision and commercial success. Gene Simmons openly embraced the commercial side, viewing Kiss as a brand and a business. Paul Stanley balanced commercial instincts with genuine musical passion. But Ace and Peter Criss were always more purely artistic, more interested in the music than the merchandising. That philosophical difference tore the band apart. Gene and Paul wanted control because they believed they understood what would make Kiss successful long-term. Ace and Peter wanted freedom because they believed authenticity mattered more than calculated success. Neither side was entirely wrong. Kiss did become one of the most financially successful bands in rock history, validating Gene's business approach. But they also lost something essential along the way: the raw danger that had made them special in the first place. The lost 1980 recordings represent Ace's side of that argument. They're what happens when a musician creates without compromise, without focus groups, without concern for radio formats or marketing strategies. They're pure artistic expression, and the fact that they remained hidden for decades is a tragedy, but it's also a statement. Sometimes art doesn't win. Sometimes the business side crushes the creative side. Sometimes brilliant work never reaches its audience because the machinery of the industry can't accommodate it. Ace Frehley's career has been defined by this tension. His natural talent is undeniable. His influence on rock guitar is significant. But he's also been frustrated repeatedly by the industry's demands, by expectations that didn't align with his vision, by compromises that felt like betrayals. The 1980 recordings are the ultimate symbol of that frustration. Music that could have mattered, that should have been heard, locked away because circumstances weren't right. Music history is full of lost recordings, abandoned projects, albums that almost happened. The Beatles aborted Get Back sessions before they became Let It Be. Prince's infamous vault containing thousands of unreleased songs. Jimi Hendrix's unfinished work at the time of his death. These lost works fascinate us because they represent potential alternative timelines where music history went differently. Ace Frehley's 1980 album sits in that category now. It's a ghost, a shadow, a possibility. We know it exists. We know it was good, possibly great. But we can't fully experience it, and maybe that mystery is part of its power. The album that could have saved Kiss becomes more legendary precisely because it didn't. The recordings that stayed hidden for 40 years become more valuable because they represent a pure artistic moment, uncorrupted by commercial release and critique. For Ace himself, those tapes must carry complex emotions. They're evidence of his talent and vision during a difficult period. They're proof that he was creating meaningful work even as his relationship with Kiss was collapsing. But they're also a reminder of opportunities lost, of battles fought and lost, of music that never found its audience when it should have. The discovery in 2019 gave Ace a chance to reconsider these recordings, to perhaps finally share them with the world. Whether that happens or not, the story itself has value. It reminds us that great art isn't always commercially successful, that brilliant work sometimes stays hidden, and that the music we never hear can be just as important as the music we do. The lost 1980 album is now part of Kiss mythology, part of Ace Frehley's legend. It represents everything the band could have been if they'd chosen a different path, if they'd valued raw authenticity over calculated success. And sometimes, the power of what never was is stronger than the reality of what happened. Those 12 songs, hidden in a cardboard box for 40 years, represent a moment of pure creativity uncompromised by industry demands. They're a time capsule of an artist at a crossroads, creating something beautiful that the world wasn't ready to hear. Maybe someday, those recordings will be properly released, and we'll finally experience Ace Frehley's lost masterpiece. Or maybe they'll remain hidden, a mystery and a legend, the album that could have saved Kiss but stayed locked away, proof that sometimes the best music is the music we never hear.